All right, so to start off, just to introduce myself real quick, my name is Mike Morrison. I'm the Director of Communications for American Majority. We're a conservative nonprofit. We teach people across the country how to win elections, how to be involved in their communities, how to be a more civically minded and a better participant in our country's government. So you can reach me on Twitter at Mike K. Morrison. We're using the hashtag AMTrain when we tweet about our training. So feel free to reach out. Follow us online too. We'd be happy to have you there. And if you enjoy this training and would like to go through similar training programs in the future, we have a number of opportunities on our online courses on our website, americanmajority.org. You can find those there. Click the online courses tab and see everything from our candidate training programs um, to specific courses on social media and how to use social media for campaigns. There's some great options there if you want to get deeper into this knowledge and to learn more about how you can be involved. So let's get started. So why does crisis communications matter? And what am I talking about when I say crisis communications? Right. So a crisis, obviously, if something has gone wrong, there's oftentimes an external thing that has caused this issue. You've been surprised by something outside of your control. A crisis is something that oftentimes happens to you. People are vulnerable to crises. It's not. Nobody's immune to this. From dog catcher to president, anybody can get caught up in a crisis communications scenario. So it's worth understanding what's out there and preparing yourself. So that's kind of my final point here. There's a lot that you can do ahead of time, even when a crisis comes up seemingly out of nowhere. There are ways that you can prepare to make it easier to navigate the crisis and to make it out the other side. So crisis comms matters because it happens to everybody, and it's something that you can prepare for and to deal with. So we want to talk a lot today about this guy. This is Governor Ralph Northam. He is the governor of Virginia. He was a pediatric neurologist. He won the governorship in 2017, 53.9 to 45, a 9-point separation there that was more than people expected. He won pretty resoundingly here. In Virginia, governors of the Commonwealth here only serve a single 4-year term. They're termed out after one term. So some stuff worth considering. And give me a thumbs up if you've been paying attention to the news. Who's seen what's happened to Governor Northam over the last couple weeks here? Oh, I'm sure a few of you. There's a bunch of thumbs going up there. Yeah, it's been an exciting week in Virginia. I'm here in Alexandria, so I've been paying attention to this. Our national headquarters is here in Percival, so it is something all of us have been watching. So the crisis really struck Northam pretty hard. This is a yearbook of his. If you can see on the right there, that's a pretty clear picture of an individual dressed up in a KKK outfit and someone else who's darkened their skin with some kind of makeup to make themselves be what's called blackface. So a pretty offensive, pretty terrible photo. That's kind of shocking to have in the yearbook here. So here, let's break down a little bit more of what's happened. Let's go through a timeline of events. Let's go top to bottom here, and we'll go through everything that's happened. So Friday morning, a website called Big League Politics published this photo. They got a tip from somebody. It was the 1984 yearbook photo from the medical school that Ralph Northam was a part of. He was 25 at the time. This picture was published there and pretty immediately confirmed by other news outlets. Both local Virginia outlets and national outlets made it to the school, found the picture themselves, and confirmed that this was indeed on Ralph Northam's yearbook page. So this kind of leads us to point one. We're going to go through, I think, 4 points here of our big, how to prepare, how to deal with a crisis. Number one, don't cause a crisis in the first place. Most politicians get themselves into hot water, and they do it to themselves. They make unforced errors. They do things that they had no business doing, and if they just hadn't done it in the first place, there wouldn't have been an issue, and they could have done other things. So from on the outsides there, you've got Anthony Weiner and Hillary Clinton. Of course, Anthony Weiner with his numerous sexual scandals, both on cheating with his wife and then also communicating with underage girls. Hillary Clinton, on the other side, of course, was dogged by the email scandal. Had she just used the email that was provided for her, so much of the controversies surrounding her presidential campaign just never would have come up. But her insistence and making that an issue caused a crisis for her. In the center there, does anybody know who those two guys are? Those are both Republicans. Well, in the center, we've got, I just clicked over to see the attendee chat to see if anybody had posted anything. Seeing nothing, don't worry about it. You don't need to know who they are as I click away here. So on the left side there next to Anthony Weiner, that is Mark Sanford, former governor and then former congressman now. He, of course, was also having an affair and ran out of the country for some time and somehow was able to recover his career and become a congressman again. So he went through his own crisis. And then on the right side there, that's Aaron Schock. He was a congressman in Illinois. He was dogged by scandal as well. He was having an interview with the style reporter of the Washington Post, and the Post reporter noticed how flamboyant his office was and realized it was decorated in the style of Downton Abbey. And the ridiculous decorations in that office sprung some investigations into how he was spending money otherwise. People found out that he was using taxpayer money to buy tickets to go to Katy Perry concerts with his staff and to do a bunch of other things that are not appropriate to use taxpayer dollars for. So he's being prosecuted at the moment. We'll see what, if any, punishment he gets to deal with. But all of these crises, those are all self-caused. These guys chose to cheat on their spouses. They chose to misuse funds. They chose to hide emails. They chose to do things that put themselves in trouble. Obviously, you can't go back and change the past, but you can control what you're doing and how you're doing it. So to all extent possible, don't cause crises. All right, let's go back to the timeline and get through the rest of it here. So had Northam worn any other costume back then, I hesitate to even call this a costume. This is, both of these are, supremely offensive and not something that anybody should wear. But had he done anything else, he'd probably still be a pretty popular governor of a Democratic governor who had some serious 2020 prospects, especially as a vice presidential candidate. Now that's absolutely out the window. His political career is, probably close to over. So as this continues, later that evening on Friday evening, Northam released a statement saying, in part, "I'm deeply sorry for the decision I made to appear as I did in this photo and for the hurt that decision caused then and now. This behavior is not in keeping with who I am today." So early statement, he released it quickly. Some issues with this. For one, he kind of changes his mind about this statement, which we'll get to in a moment. But also, this is an admission that he was in it, right? So he's admitted that this was him, but he also hasn't admitted, which one was him. I don't think he necessarily had to do that. But, here's the first admission of this, right? So later that night, Northam also then admitted in a video apology, but stated he plans to regain the people's trust and finish his term. At this point, the Legislative Black Caucus, which is largely aligned with the Democrats, called for his resignation, as a number of state-based Democrat leaders. So he's admitted that he's part of this and that he was in this picture, and now people are telling him that he's got to resign. But it's not over. Saturday morning, National Democrats started to call for him to resign, including a bunch of Republicans. Nancy Pelosi was one of the National Democrats that called for his resignation. But Northam starts to announce that there's going to be a press conference. And then rumors start to come out that Northam believes he wasn't in the photo. He's starting to change his story and change the way that he is going to present this issue and is going to say so in his press conference. So Saturday afternoon, the press conference happens. During the press conference, Northam states, in part, he reflected with his family and classmates and came to the conclusion, I am not the person in the photo. So a pretty shocking reversal from the previous night. It got worse. The press conference started to go south pretty quickly. when asked why, Northam explained that he had actually dressed in blackface previously, and that he had used some shoe tar or something like that to darken his face to make him to wear a Michael Jackson costume. This was an admission that he'd done blackface, which he didn't realize was an issue, and kept saying that he couldn't have done it the second time because he'd done it before and he wouldn't have done it again. Which, if you're trying to get out of crisis, you're introducing more crisis to the situation. A bad step there, but it takes another worse step. As this tweet says, OMG, someone asked Northam if he can still moonwalk, and he looked around as if searching for enough space to show off the move. His wife jumped in to say it was not the appropriate circumstance. Now, if you go back and watch the video, he is treating this badly. He's treating this lightly. He has gone from apologizing, saying that it was him and he's sorry, to claiming it wasn't him, to claiming that he's done it before, but it wasn't actually, him this time, to mocking the whole situation with his lightheartedness. This is a big deal. And let me jump back a screen. Sorry, didn't mean to move forward quite yet. So this is a big deal. At this point, calls for his resignation really increase. He is in a lot of hot water, and a bunch of this is developed recently, but we can focus on this kind of 2 or 3 day stretch here to outline the issues that their team caused and what they could have actually done. So let's imagine real quick that we are part of Northam's staff, right? We are people that are trying to protect the Democratic Party. We're people that are trying to protect him as the governor. We are trying to get out of this crisis situation as nicely as possible. What would we do in this circumstance, right? Well, the first thing we would do is we'd prepare. We'd want to prepare beforehand. First, you want to find the weaknesses and threats that are part of your candidate, that are part of the person that you're working for. Understand points that could be an issue for them. Next, you want to identify and train your crisis team. You have to know how to respond. You have to be ready to respond. Think of this like how FEMA trains and how we have firefighters and policemen. They're people who are specifically trained to come in a crisis and do something. They have roles that they know what their roles are. They're organized and they know how to go about their business when bad stuff starts happening. They develop that plan before crisis happens, right? Because if crisis happens and they don't have a plan, things are going to be in trouble. And finally, you want to develop media context and a strategy, as well as producing holding statements to hold people over. So let's go into each one of those points as we jump across the screen here. So first, you want to develop a critical view of your own weaknesses. Be honest with yourself. Who have you wronged? What has your candidate done wrong? If people researched your financial history, if they dug through your records, what are they going to find? Did you ever have a time when you didn't pay as many taxes as you owed? Have you been bankrupt? Have you been foreclosed on? There are a bunch of things in your financial history that can be found, not only if you're running for office, but just generally speaking, there's more information than you realize that's out there. So understanding that this is an avenue of threat, you can be prepared for it. You know that these things have happened in the past. You know that, perhaps you went through a messy divorce and it didn't end great. There are obvious things that could be a threat to you that you can prepare for, right? This final line here, we want to do oppo on ourselves. This is opposition research in the campaign world. It's trying to understand the kind of things that people can find out about you. It's understanding, the avenues that people will use to attack you. So what I'm saying here is you don't have to be a saint to win, right? We've got a guy in the Oval Office who, even his biggest supporters, I don't think would necessarily call a saint, right? There are skeletons in his closet. He was forced to apologize for a bunch of things on the campaign trail. I'm thinking specifically about things like the Access Hollywood take. But listen, if you know that there's bombs out there, if you know that there's bumps in the road, it's going to be easier to prepare to respond to those things, right? You don't have to be perfect. Everybody's made mistakes, and that shouldn't preclude you from a public life. But knowing that is an avenue, that's a chink in your armor, that's an avenue for somebody to attack you, is crucial. Not only knowing that, but preparing your response for that is crucial. right? So part of preparing is preparing your team. You've got to understand there's a golden rule of media training, right? That's practice everything. The first time that you're speaking in public shouldn't be the first time, the first time you're giving your speech shouldn't be the first time that you're saying it in front of a bunch of people. You should prepare these things ahead of time. You should practice with your team. You can go through mock interviews. You can practice specifically to do things on television, right? So this is the kind of thing that Governor Northam probably should have practiced. He probably should have practiced this press conference beforehand. He probably should have gone through this and understood the kind of questions that were going to be asked and had a better response to this. Sometimes you can practice in your head too. Game these things out. Imagine the ways that this could go wrong. Imagine the kind of things that people could say. Imagine how you're going to respond to them. But planning this stuff out when you beforehand is going to make you better at this, right? So just in the same way that football teams practice, that they watch tape, that they have a scout team that runs the offense of the team that they're going to go play against, but in the Super Bowl or something like that, if you can prepare yourself for what you know is in front of you, if you can do it over and over again in practice, then you can do it in public. So, the first time that you go on TV shouldn't be the first time that you've seen yourself on camera. You can do this a bunch beforehand, and I urge you to do so. So managing the media as a whole, obviously there's a bunch of different avenues, and your team should be aware of this too, right? Your team should understand how to communicate to different people, how to participate with different outlets. So let's break that down. There's 4 big ones, kind of archetypes, right? Let's go from oldest to newest. First is print. Generally speaking, stories in print are longer, much more detailed. The reporters are oftentimes more knowledgeable in specific areas or issue sets. Sometimes that's not the case, especially in digital mediums, but a lot of the time the reporters have been in and around these issues that they're writing on and a part of for some time. So you have to take their experience into account. There's oftentimes the chance to correct a misstatement too. So when it's not being broadcast out live immediately, you have the opportunity to, if you said a statistic incorrectly, you can oftentimes come back and have that corrected for the record. Next is radio. Obviously, there's an emphasis on your voice, on your ability to speak clearly, to speak in a way that people can understand without saying like I just did there, right? There's a huge opportunity to communicate to people on radio. I'd put podcasts in the same group as radio. This is also an avenue to communicate to people. You can speak visually in this medium. This is a way to, as you're communicating these things, you can't just monotone read off a statement. You really do have to treat it like a conversation and treat it as an engagement between the two of you. It's also an okay place to use notes. Obviously, if you're on camera, referring to notes can be distracting. It can look like you're unprepared, but when people don't have a visual on you, when they can't see you, it's easier to refer to some notes and refer to some talking points or statistics if you need them. Television is one of the harder mediums to communicate on. Short, simple answers are crucial to get across correctly the first time. When it is broadcast live out to everywhere all at once and say for eternity, it is an easy place to get yourself in hot water. So there's an obvious emphasis on appearance and technique. So make sure you look the part too. This is another concern about what Ralph Northam did in his press conference, right? As he pretty obviously was leaning over the podium and looking around for a space to do the moonwalk, it was pretty clear how insincere he was about this position, how he didn't understand the severity of what he'd done and his need to look like he was, his statements should be reflected in his actions too, right? And they obviously weren't. So finally, digital. Short, always updating websites. Think, of course, like Twitter and Facebook, things where trending things pull up and swap out pretty quickly. It's even shorter, of course, than digital or print, than print formats or video. Gatekeepers also matter far less. You don't need a TV network or a reporter with a print distribution to be able to get your message out. There still is a visual focus. You can obviously write and publish blogs. You can get these things out there, but you can also use video and pictures instead of just text. So their video and pictures perform much better online. They get a much larger reach than they would otherwise. Finally, you want to be consistent across your platforms. Just because each platform has its strengths and weaknesses doesn't mean that your message changes. You need to adapt it to the platform, but you also need to recognize that it has to stay the same, that the message has to be clearly communicated and consistently communicated across all those avenues. All right, let's jump back to the timeline. Again, Northam released his Friday night statement, taking responsibility. Saturday, he uses a digital statement, right? He posts a picture, he posts a video on his social media pages explaining the issues. And then finally, he moves into the press conference aspect of this, right? So what I want to talk about here is duct tape. So I'm sure you've used duct tape before in your life. It's a pretty powerful tool. Duct tape was a crucial ingredient to bringing the astronauts home safe. I believe it was Apollo 13, right? When it was crashing to Earth, it literally helped save their lives and helped make sure that they still had oxygen to breathe. Duct tape's a pretty powerful thing, but it's not perfect, right? So if you imagine you got a piece of duct tape and you're trying to seal something, but you keep peeling it off and sticking it back on, peeling it off, sticking it on, peel and stick, peel and stick, peel and stick. Eventually, what's going to happen? It's not going to be as sticky, right? It's not going to be able to make a seal. It's not going to be able to close it off. It's going to become worthless. This is kind of what Northam has done with his statements. The fact that he has so changed his statements so radically from his moonwalking press conference to his initial message taking responsibility. It shows insincerity. It really obfuscates the message and made it a lot harder for them to communicate in this crisis and to make it through unscathed. So, your crisis response is in many ways kind of like duct tape. If you put it on right the first time, it can hold and it can get you home. But if you don't, it's not gonna last. It's gonna tear. So let's dive into this a little bit more. Everybody can plan. We can all make as many plans as we want. But as Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. The other side gets a vote too. I think it was Patton maybe who said that the enemy gets a vote as well. Your battle plans and the ways that you strategize are great, but they've got to contact reality. And as soon as they do, they're going to have to change. So when crisis starts, this is step 3 of our crisis response plan. You want to breathe deep and find the truth. So first, take a deep breath. Don't react. Don't panic. If you shoot from the hip, if you go out half-cocked, if you release statements too early, if you trap yourselves in a statement that you shouldn't have trapped yourselves in, it's going to limit your ability to respond, and it's going to make it a lot harder to get the end result that you want. So take a deep breath, release a holding statement, and give everybody an expectation. So what I mean by holding statement. So imagine on Friday night, instead of releasing this initial statement, Northam comes back with a different response. So in this situation, right, what does Northam end up doing? He backtracks really hard. He shouldn't have released this statement if he didn't know that it was true, or if that he was going to change his mind and go a different direction. These holding over statements can really tide everybody over. Why is there a picture of a bloomin' onion? Perhaps, Australia's greatest appetizer? Well, it's because the bloomin' onion's dangerous, right? So if you get one of these and plus the Outback bread and eat too much of that beforehand, you're not going to be hungry for dinner. If you overeat on the appetizer, nobody's going to hear you later. Nobody wants to eat the meal later. Similarly, if you release too many statements, if you let people eat too much stuff early, then they're not going to be appetized, they're going to be full. They're not going to be ready to hear your statements later. So in the same way, you don't want to give them a final statement like this. You want to go with a holding statement. So what that means is Northam should have said something like, I've seen this picture released. It disturbs me deeply. I am going to have a press conference tomorrow afternoon to fully explain this situation, both to the voters of Virginia. Boom. What does something like that do? It accepts that this picture is concerning. It says that there's going to be a response and gives somebody a time frame. Why would you want to do this? Because it takes care of your team. You really have to talk to your team in a communications crisis too. In these situations, if you leave your stakeholders hanging, if you leave your supporters hanging, it's going to be a lot harder for you to come out the other side relatively unscathed. So who do I mean by stakeholders? Obviously, your donors and your party allies, people that funded your campaign and that helped you get elected, but it's also your family and your staff. Your family is an obvious one too. You should be somebody that supports your family, but your staff is one that people forget. If you've got a 18, 19, 20-year-old intern answering phones in the office, they're going to be the tip of the spear. They're going to be the first one that has to hear it when an angry voter calls asking about why the governor's appeared in this picture. Those people need to be communicated with too. Those people are stakeholders too. So don't forget those people. So a holding message helps people from being left hanging, right? So specifically in this instance, Friday night, the Legislative Black Caucus comes out and a number of other Democratic leaders do and say that Northam needs to resign. Had he released a holding statement, he wouldn't have left them hanging. Had he communicated more clearly with his allies, he could have given them some cover to say, listen, this is a big issue. I'm very concerned about it. I want to wait and hear what the governor has to say at his press conference tomorrow, and I'll come out with a full statement. Sure, you're going to have some people peel off. Sure, some people are going to back out by then. But if you give some people cover, if you communicate clearly with your stakeholders, you can survive a crisis communications issue and keep your allies intact. So staving out these calls for him to resign makes it harder. It makes it a little bit easier for him. And, imagine from the Legislative Black Caucus's perspective. Imagine they see the press conference tomorrow and find it believable. But unfortunately, they've already called for him to resign. Do they backtrack on that statement and say, well, given that, no, I think it's okay. But they probably imagined that Northam had released his final statement on the issue, that he had taken responsibility. So with that in mind, they thought the conclusion was clear. If they didn't think the conclusion was clear, if they thought Northam was going to bring more information to the table, they might not have called for him to resign as quickly. So because of this, Northam helped back his own allies into a corner, and it's hurt his response since then. Okay, next you want to find the truth. What happened? Who was involved? Are we at fault? Perhaps most importantly, is more coming? Is this it? In Northam's case, it wasn't. There was another yearbook picture that came out. I don't know what his issue in yearbooks is, but another yearbook picture came out with some racist nicknames that Governor Northam had collected in his time at Virginia Military Institute. So this wasn't it for him. He probably knew that other things were out there or could have found out if other things were out there. If you prepare, this is going to be a less frenzied state, right? If you knew that there was opposition research, if you knew that this was an avenue for attack, then you would be more prepared for a response. You wouldn't have to dig too deeply into this research. But because they weren't prepared, that has made this harder. So finding out what else is out there, what's true, what's coming, that's very important towards the next step. Oh, and I shouldn't have to remind everybody of this, but don't lie, do not lie. One more time, don't lie. People think that a lot of times communications is about not telling the truth or is about obfuscating and trying to get one over on people, and that's just not how you should do it. Number one, that's not the right way to live. Number two, it's not going to be successful in the long run. Eventually you get found out. Eventually the truth comes out. And it really just always does. You don't get away with stuff. Things are going to be found out. And if you do get away with something, the truth is still out there. It can still be found. It can still be brought up. These things have a way of rising to the top, and the truth does have a way of coming out. That's not true in all circumstances, but it's true in enough circumstances that lying about it isn't going to work. Remember Anthony Weiner, right? He lied and said that his Twitter account was hacked, that these pictures were not his, that things were posted without him. And then, in the course of a few days, he had to come around and admit that wasn't true. The lying compounds the scandal. If you don't lie, then you can avoid a lot of the scandal. Okay, next step, responding to the crisis. Tell it all, tell it fast, rip the Band-Aid off. This might seem like not the thing you would want to do, that you would want to hide information if you can, but that's not going to work in a crisis. It's going to get found out. The drips are going to keep coming. The investigations are going to keep hitting. It's going to be found out. So you want to be the primary and final source of information. When you are the person that gives people the information, when the information comes from you, it stings less than if it continues dogging you. If you have to release 5 statements as you continue having new information coming out, and as compared to releasing 1, it's going to continue to extend the issue, extend the news cycle, and make it harder and harder and harder for you to get out of. Ripping the Band-Aid off, telling the truth, coming clean is the best way to deal with it. Just like in the duct tape, right? A single application of it can hold a lot. But if you keep trying to reapply it, if you keep tearing it off and putting it different places, it eventually is going to wear out. And the same thing can be said for the voters' patients. So understand these issues, understand why you want to tell the truth, and go from there. That doesn't mean that you want to give all your dirt right away. There's ways to do it in a strategic manner, and we'll talk about those. So that's kind of in responding the right way. So in doing that, a lot of this is going to be, again, back to managing the media. So as you are preparing your response and explaining these things, you want to anticipate the worst. Anticipate the worst questions, the hardest questions being asked. They are going to be thrown at you. Reporters, generally speaking, are trying to find things that are scandalous, and they know that that's the stuff that gets printed on the front page, and that's the stuff that leads the bottom of the hour, the top of the hour news broadcast. They want to get those hits. They want to get those juiciest bits. So with that in mind, understand that they are going to ask questions that drive to some of the most sensitive parts of the issue, right? But you can do things with this, right? So number 1 is the rule of silence. You don't have to say something. It's okay to be quiet. There is this insistence in our conversation a lot of the time to fill the quiet spaces with conversation. And skilled interviewers will use this against you. They will ask you a question, let you respond, and then after you're done responding, they just won't say anything. And they'll let you fill the space with noise. They'll let you keep talking. That's not what you want to do, right? You don't have to fill the air. You don't have to fill the silence. It's not your, you don't have to do that. So understand and be comfortable with silence. Understand how it's used against you in the interview process. It's worth remembering, too, that interviews are not conversations. It is an adversarial strategic communications. It's not necessarily about getting to the truth even. So understand how conversations like this work, understand how the strategy of these conversations work, and understand how you need to conduct yourself to come off as good as possible. Next, blocking and bridging. This is another helpful technique in the interviewing process. You probably have seen and heard politicians do this and been annoyed by it. So for one, your message is paramount. You want to block and bridge to your message. You want to stop a reporter from getting you off track and talking about something you don't want to talk about, and instead push to your language that you do want to talk about. This is helpful in normal comms issues too, but especially helpful in crisis situations. As Colin Powell said, you don't have to answer their questions. They get to ask the questions, but you get to answer them. So what are some examples of blocking and bridging? So you can say things like, well, that speaks to a bigger point, which allows you to immediately shift from their question to something else, right? You can say, well, the real issue is, there's another way to do it. You can also say something like, it's not our policy to discuss that specifically, but here's something I can tell you. Imagine a situation where perhaps somebody in your office has committed a crime or has done something wrong and has been found out about it. You could say something like, well, it's not our policy to discuss specific employment issues and specific HR issues. However, I can tell you that so-and-so has been removed from their position. They will not be serving any longer in this administration. There are ways that you can push away from talking about specifics that you would like to avoid towards talking about the things that you do want to talk about. Headlining is our next one. This is a way for you to present the most important thing first, right? It's a big red flag that you are waving to the reader, to the listener, saying this is the important thing that you need to look at, right? If you see the last one there, that's one that our previous president liked to say a lot. Let me be clear. And he'd pause right at the end of it, right before saying exactly what it was that he wanted to make sure people knew. You could say other things like, listen, the most important thing to remember here is, where you could, if you're wrapping up a conversation, if it's been long and gone in a bunch of different directions, this is a good one. I've talked about a lot of these things, but it really boils down to these elements. This is you're standing on a hill, waving a giant red flag, telling people this is what you need to pay attention to. Okay, next. You want to repeat yourself. You want to repeat yourself again. And then you want to repeat yourself one more time. Why? For one, this helps you from saying things that you shouldn't say. In interviews, so in like the Daily Show, the old Colbert thing, a lot of the ways that they would get people to say dumb stuff in those pre-recorded interviews is they would record them for hours. They would have 3-hour-long plus interviews where they had people sitting in front of cameras and they would ask them the same questions multiple times, over and over and over again, sometimes right after the other. This was frustrating for the interviewees. They realized, I've already answered this. I've already said this. But what would happen is, rather than repeating the same question, they'd get tired of repeating the same question and say something else. And oftentimes that's where people got into trouble. So rather than use the clip where, they said the same thing 4 times in a row and it was a good response and it wasn't going to cause any issues, the Daily Show would pick the response that was the most inflammatory, or that was the least well rehearsed, or where the person looked the most exasperated. So be calm, repeat yourself over and over again, keep your cool. But the last thing that you don't want to do here is you don't want to repeat negatives. So in Northam's case, you don't want to keep repeating that this was you and that you were wrong. Instead, you would want to repeat good things. Say, for example, I had made mistakes in my past. I'm not proud of this. This was wrong of me to do, and I recognize that now. And I recognize that because of all the community work that I've done, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And you repeat the good things about yourself rather than continuing to go back to the specific yearbook photo, right? So lastly, you've got to learn that you just can't avoid crisis sometimes. This is just going to get you sometimes, and you have to learn from experience. It's worth paying attention to other crises to help you avoid crises to avoid your own. So in Northam's case, we've kind of hit this one a lot. I think the press conference was really his biggest downfall. So I wanted to ask you guys, how would you have responded? You've got a chat function there if you want to use and to let me know how you think you would respond in this situation, how you would have done this differently. If you want to use that attendee chat, you can post a message. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. We'll give it a second, see if anybody has any responses. You can send those directly to me, and I think I've got it set right now so other people won't see them. Looks like nobody wants to participate today. That's fine. We'll keep going, and we'll talk about what I would have done here. So, there we go. Great. So this is what I would have suggested if I was on Northam's team. Well, obviously I'm not, so I would suggest that he resign and move on and enjoy private life in Virginia. But here's what I would have done had I been on his team Friday afternoon as this was breaking, before they'd released anything. First, I would say we should release a holding statement. We should tell everybody that we're going to have a press conference tomorrow, that this is that this is concerning to us. We're not going to take responsibility yet. We're not going to disown it. And then you would move on to finding out if it is true, right? In this situation, I think it is true. I think Northam was in these pictures. So assuming that, next, I would have Northam take ownership of it. to say that, you know what, that was me. I'm in the pictures and I'm disgusted by it. I would apologize. I would have him apologize profusely for it, to take ownership of the fact that, that this was a terrible thing for him to do. And there's no excuse. His age isn't an excuse. The time wasn't an excuse. The fact that Virginia was maybe a pretty different place back in 1984 isn't an excuse. And to recognize how wrong he was then, and to go from there to transition to talking about what he's done, right? So from then, I've become a community member. I've donated my time in these ways. I've realized this is such an issue. Systemic racism is an issue. You can start to communicate things to people that show that this isn't who you've been all the time, that this isn't the kind of person that you are going to be going forwards, that this isn't going to define your governorship and the rest of your administration. What you're doing by that is you're creating a contrast between the actions of what you've done back then and who you are today. It also starts to chart a plan forwards. It starts to explain how this is going to be different going forwards, how this isn't going to define and hasn't defined who you are for some time. That there's a path for redemption. Americans oftentimes do like a redemption story. They do like people who can come back from the brink, who can change and better themselves. It is a sympathetic story that I think we can see in a lot of places in culture and media too. So that is probably the best avenue that he could have taken to survive this crisis situation. But finally, he should be ready to resign regardless. This is something I don't think that he is considering personally, but he should be, because the crisis is really continuing in Virginia. If you've paid attention to the rest of the news here, you can see, of course, Governor Northam in the middle there. On the left side is Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax. Justin Fairfax has been accused of sexual assault by at least 2 women at this point. He's in hot water as well. And then to their other side is Mark Herring, who is the Attorney General, had also suggested that Governor Northam needs to resign because of the picture. And then it came out that there was a photo of Mark Herring dressed in blackface. He was a little bit younger at the time, but there are also many calls for him to resign too. So Herring actually is worth talking about. His communication strategy was a little bit different. Upon finding out that this was out there, he released the information himself. He said that, there's a picture out there of me in this. We expect it's going to be released. I know that it's there. And here are the reasons why. I apologize for these things, and I've done these things differently. He also has gone through his own crisis communications aspect in that way. And his might be a little more successful because of the way that he's dealt with it. We'll see. The future is kind of uncertain for these guys. We don't know what the next step holds. But it's worth remembering, too, how all this came about. For one, if you had seen the previous week, Governor Ralph Northam had made a number of comments about abortion, and specifically something that's been characterized as infanticide. I would tend to agree with that characterization, but his more extreme positions on abortion came out on a radio show, and a Virginia resident heard that, posted a video of it online, and that video started to go viral. I think it has 4 million views to date. And that simple Twitter video went so far and so wide, it eventually connected to what I believe was an alumni of the medical school that Ralph Northam went to. Remembering that this picture was there, this guy tipped off a number of media places, and from that tip turned into this whole controversy. So there was, this own crisis communications issue that he had created with his previous comments about abortion too, that kind of turned into this one. So understanding too how one of these crises can precipitate another, how another one can immediately follow from it is pretty important to do. So there are a bunch of issues with crisis communications. It is not an easy thing to do. Obviously, every single crisis is going to be a little bit different than the previous one. It is not the same, but I hope that this was helpful for you. I think we've ended a little bit sooner than I expected, which I think is nice. I'm always happy to release people a little bit early, but if anybody's got questions, you can use the presenter chat to send me a question. It'll pop on by my screen. I will be happy to answer anything that anybody's got. If you've got some questions, feel free to send them to me. I'll hang out for a minute here and let people type. Give it just a minute longer, I'm sure. Okay. Oh, got a question. Great, we got a few questions. Let me grab these real quick. Okay, good question. So what if it's something that you did recently? I think it depends on the issue. It can be it depends on the severity and depends on the issue. I think so. A good example of this might be like an affair, right? That's something that politicians do a lot of, right? So I think that it is. I think we've seen, especially with the current president, that there's a greater tolerance for crises and for some scandal than people realized with most voters. I think voters have understood that there can be a little bit more forgiveness here. So I would, I don't think that you can, I think you follow a lot of the same plans. Your response to it obviously would be a little bit different in your preparation for it. But in the same way, ripping the Band-Aid off, telling the whole truth, explaining what you did was wrong, taking responsibility for it, and providing the vision for the future and charting the next steps of what you would what you do in the future. Got a bunch of questions. This is great. They all came in like all at once. Is silence a good tool to use? Yes, I absolutely think silence can be a good tool to use. It depends. I mean, sometimes you don't want to be silent about responding to an issue. So you do want to respond to issues if they come up, but silence more in interview questions, right? So if somebody asks you a question, be okay with being quiet for a minute. Which medium first, print, radio, or TV? Depends on the severity of the response. Sometimes if it's a small thing, if it's only blowing up in a small area, a simple blog post can be enough of a statement on this issue. It kind of depends on the severity of the consequence, or excuse me, the severity of the crises, right? So a smaller crisis, you could probably respond in a smaller way. So you could view like a bad review on your web page or something as like a smaller crisis that you could respond to with a comment, right? You don't need to go on TV to respond to that. We generally advise people to kind of respond in the medium that it was issued. So obviously the specific Northam instance had turned into a national television issue, had something that was broadcast on TV. So responding in a blog finally wouldn't be the right way to do it. You do need to go on TV for that one, but responding in kind on the same medium can be a good strategy too. Here's a good one. So this one is, when is it effective to go on the offensive? This is a good question. A lot of people will have their first impulse will be to fight and to be defensive. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes a crisis comes up because the attacks are unfair or are unwarranted or untrue, and you can respond to those. You can respond to those well. I would, generally speaking, you don't want to go mudslinging necessarily. if you can help it. So it's better to the way that we like to say it in our trainings is to create contrast rather than to go negative. So if you're in a situation that's adversarial like that, where the accusations are untrue, you can be firm, you can be forceful, you can explain these things without really being on the attack, right? So I think there's a balance there. I would tend to stay away from being too aggressive, but there's a way to do that, right? Good question, Jennifer. If you know the reporter is a gotcha reporter, should you respond? I think it depends on their reach in part too. Like there are just some journalists out there that are really looking for the big hits to get people in bad situations and to attack people. It depends on how far it's flowing outside of that. I would say it can be so you got to judge the impact there, right? Is it going to go far and wide? Then you might need to release a response. But sometimes the response can also fuel more people going to it. So if it's a big enough issue, if it's something that has legs, then I think it's worth responding to. You can also respond in a more more casual, more low-key manner, whether that's a quiet post on your website that you can direct people to when they have questions, something that you don't blast far and wide. Yeah, here's another good comment. Congratulations on your run for state rep. That sounds like a blast. Good luck. Let's see. Let's do one last question. So in this instance, could you blame peer pressure? I'm thinking just for the Northam one. I think that that could be a way to do it. What you don't want to do necessarily is to make excuses to remove agency from yourself. In Northam's instance too, he was 25. Like the guy is about to get out of medical school and be a doctor and be a pediatrician. He should know better. So there is some element for you to say, listen, I'm a product of the South. I'm a product of a time when these kind of nasty, offensive, awful things were considered okay. And I was wrong. I should have known better. I didn't have the courage to stand up. I didn't have the knowledge to stand up. And this is what I've learned. And that's kind of the bridge. So there's a way for you to, you don't necessarily have to blame peer pressure. You don't want to act as if you didn't have a role to play necessarily, unless you were truly a minor, unless you truly were, it was outside of your faculties, if it was outside of your control to be able to do something about it, then that can be a way to respond. But otherwise, I would stay away from purely pushing blame. So. Well, those are a bunch of good questions. I'm glad they all flooded in like that. It was a lot of fun to do. I hope you guys have found this helpful. And if you would like to help us in the future do more of these webinars, we try to keep them free for everybody. But if you want to support us to do more programming like this, we'd really love your support. I will send you to a page where you can do just that. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time.